Hi everybody. Let's talk a little bit more about sentence diagramming. As you viewed Elizabeth O'Brien's video on sentence diagramming, you got an introduction or a refresher course on the Reed-Kellogg method of sentence diagramming. There are other ways to diagram sentences, and when I teach sentence analysis, I use a different way that enables students to keep their sentences intact. I don't remember how I learned to use this technique. It's possible that over the years I saw someone else diagram in a similar way, or maybe I was taught grammar this way in grade school. I can't be certain that this form of sentence analysis has a name, but I'm sure that I'm not the first person to use this diagramming strategy, even though I've probably given this method my own spin. But for now, for the sake of showing you this technique for this specific methods class, I'll call this strategy Nancy's Way, and it looks like this. You'll see that I've used parentheses, lines, labels, and sometimes I use brackets and arrows to analyze a sentence without disrupting its syntax. Your students and you might find this technique a little more logical because it takes students through a series of questions and answers to draw grammatical conclusions. And before I show you that series of questions and answers, I do want to offer one disclaimer. As I progress through these steps, I might mention some grammatical concepts that either you've forgotten or never learned. Don't worry about that for now. I'm just showing you how I diagram. But do take note that the grammar concepts in this video are those that students should know in secondary school. So if you need to refresh your knowledge of some of these concepts, make note of them and let me know if you need my help with them. Also, in the interest of teaching grammar in the context of a reading and writing assignment, I will diagram sentences from Rodolfo Anaya's Bless Me Ultima. The following passage comes from page 80 of the novel, and it appears after Samuel has told Antonio about the golden carp. I shivered. I had never heard a story like this one. It was getting late, and I thought of my mother. The setting sun glistened in the brown waters of the river and turned them to bronze. I'll start with the simplest sentence in this passage so that I can label the basic components of a sentence, the subject and the predicate. So we have I shivered. I always start by finding the verb. Students first need to know what a verb is, so teach them that first before you start diagramming. The verb indicates the action in a sentence. So is there any action reflected in this sentence? Yes, it's shivered. We can see a person shivering. We can ask ourselves, how does someone shiver? So this is an action verb. Let's underline that twice. Once we find the verb, we can ask a question to find the subject. Who shivered or what shivered? The answer is I shivered. So I is the subject of the sentence. So let's underline that once. Whenever I mark subjects and verbs in a sentence, I underline the verb twice and the subject once. If you want to, you can also teach your students to use different colors when they use these different markings. Okay, now let's diagram the second sentence from the passage. It's a simple sentence, but it has more to it than the first one. I had never heard a story like this one. Understand that for the sake of showing you Nancy's way, I'm pointing out several grammatical concepts at once. Before you have your students mark these concepts in a sentence, they'll first need some instruction on what they are. For instance, before they can locate a subject and a verb, they first need instruction on what subjects are and what verbs are. Before students can find direct and indirect objects, they're first going to need some instruction on what those objects are and what they do. I don't recommend that you teach all of those concepts at once. Please allow your students to build their knowledge. This diagramming strategy does make it a little easier for students to scaffold their grammatical knowledge, but again, let them build. Okay, so let's diagram this sentence. First, let's find the verb because it's the heartbeat of the sentence. So I ask myself, where is the action reflected in this sentence? In this case, the verb heard indicates an action. But this sentence also has a linking verb, and so we need to also underline had this way. So your students are going to need to be able to recognize what a linking verb is and what an action verb is. But the verb in this sentence is had heard. And then we ask ourselves a question: who had heard or what had heard? The answer is I. I had heard, and so I is the subject of the sentence, and we underline that once. Now we can ask ourselves, I had heard what? And the answer to that question is the direct object. So I'm going to ask myself, I had heard what? I had heard a story. Story is the direct object. So I will mark it with a D-O to stand for direct object. But what about never? Your students are going to ask you about this word here. If they have already learned about adverbs, then they know that an adverb is a modifier that explains when or how or to what extent. And never explains when. And it describes when I had heard. And so we can draw an arrow from the verb to the adverb to show that description. Now we're left with a phrase at the end of the sentence. This is a prepositional phrase, the preposition being like. So we can mark the preposition with this P. I always mark phrases, prepositional phrases, verbal phrases with parentheses. And so I drew parentheses around this phrase. Again, I marked the preposition with the P, and we can ask ourselves a question to find the object of this preposition. Like what? Like this one. So we can mark one with an OP to stand for object of the preposition. If students already know how to find subjects and verbs, but they need to learn direct objects and indirect objects, focus on those concepts, those labels, and those questions. Again, don't feel like students need to know how to label everything at one time. The sentence I just diagrammed was a simple sentence. You can also diagram compound and complex sentences. I use brackets to mark the different clauses. The brackets help me to differentiate between clauses and phrases. So here's an example from Anaya's novel on page 81. When I got home, my mother was very angry with me. Let's say that I want to teach my students how complex sentences are constructed. I could use this sentence as an example. I can use brackets to illustrate where one clause ends and another begins, and the brackets also help me to highlight that a clause has a subject and a verb. So I'll start again with finding the verbs in this sentence. So where are the words that indicate action? In this sentence, the students will have a bit of a challenge because was is a to be verb and got is, well, you can't really see someone getting or gotting, but they are verbs of the sentence, so we would underline these verbs twice. Then we'd ask the subject questions. Who got? The answer to that is I got. So I is the subject of this verb, and so we'll underline it once. And then let's ask the same question about was. Who was? The answer is mother. So mother is the subject of that verb. So we have two verbs and we have two different subjects. Looks like we have two clauses because a clause has a subject and a verb. So let's use brackets to indicate where those clauses are. We'll start with the clause that can stand on its own, which is called an independent clause. My mother was very angry with me. By itself, that sentence expresses a complete thought, so we'll put brackets around that clause. When I got home also has a subject and a verb. I got. But the word when makes that clause unable to stand on its own. It doesn't express a complete thought. It's a dependent clause. It depends on this independent clause in order to have a complete thought. But because it has a subject and a verb, it is a clause, and so we're going to mark it off with brackets. If we want to, we can circle this dependent word, when, which is also called a subordinating conjunction, to indicate that this word is the reason that this clause is dependent. I find that this form of sentence diagramming helps me to explain other language conventions such as punctuation concepts. For instance, if we're learning how to use commas, I could explain that when a dependent clause appears at the beginning of a sentence, then we put a comma after the dependent clause. This form of diagramming helps me to illustrate how punctuation guidelines are grounded in the syntax or grammar of the sentence and not because of a pause or not because it sounds right. We can diagram compound sentences in similar ways. Here's a sentence from page 80 of Bless Me Ultima. That fish made his home in the waters of the river, and he was sacred to the gods. Now let's go through our series of questions again. Where are the verbs? One is made, which is an action verb, and the other one is was, which is a to be verb or a linking verb. So we underline both of those verbs twice. Now, let's ask the subject questions for each verb. What made? The fish made. And so fish is the subject of this verb, and we will underline it once. Over here for this verb, who was sacred? He was sacred. And so this pronoun he is the subject of this verb, and we will underline it once. Again, we have two verbs in this sentence, and each verb has its own subject. So we have two clauses in the sentence, and we'll mark these clauses with brackets. Now, what is joining these two clauses? We have a conjunction and. So this might be an opportunity to teach your students about coordinating conjunctions. We might decide to mark our conjunctions with circles. We could also label them with the big C for conjunction, whatever you think works best for your students. Now, let's read the clauses aloud. That fish made his home in the waters of the river. That clause can stand on its own as a sentence, so we have an independent clause here. We could label this independent clause with an IC. Let's read the other clause. He was sacred to the gods. Yes, that one can stand on its own also, so we have another independent clause. So let's also mark this one with an IC. So this is a good example of how to teach students to recognize a compound sentence. A compound sentence consists of two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction. And as we diagram the parts of the sentence, we can see that's exactly what we have. We can also use this sentence to mark prepositional phrases. Let's look for the prepositional phrases in this compound sentence. Do we see any prepositions in this sentence? Well, I see one here, in, and I see another one, of, and then I see a third, to. Once we've found the preposition, we can ask a question about that preposition to find the object. So we'll look at this preposition in. In the what? In the waters. So waters would be the object of that preposition. Let's put parentheses around this prepositional phrase, and we can mark this preposition with a P, and then we'll mark this object with an OP to stand for object of the preposition. We located another preposition here, of. So we ask ourselves, of the what? Of the river. So river is the object of that preposition. We can put this phrase, this prepositional phrase, in parentheses. We will label the preposition with a P, and the object of the preposition with an OP. And finally, we have the preposition to. Let's go ahead and label that with the P. And then we'll ask ourselves, to the what? To the gods. And so gods is the object of the preposition. And we'll mark this prepositional phrase also in parentheses. So you can see that once you have diagrammed your sentence pretty specifically, it can be well marked up with codes and punctuation marks. I want to reiterate that as I showed you how this diagramming method works, I've also shown you a lot of different grammatical concepts: subjects, verbs, objects, action verbs, linking verbs, phrases, clauses, conjunctions, prepositions. Please understand that I do not think that you should try to teach students all of these concepts all at once. It makes sense for you to first assess what your students already know, and then when you introduce a new grammatical concept, introduce it in the process of building what students already know. Also, I recommend that you have a purpose for these lessons. Often the grammatical concepts are a way to scaffold mechanical or usage concepts. So Nancy's way, for instance, helps students to identify sentence fragments, or it can help students figure out how to punctuate. You saw a few minutes ago how we used Nancy's way to determine whether a comma should go after an introductory dependent clause. This technique helps students to determine whether to use certain homonyms such as affect or effect. Because one is a noun and one is a verb, Nancy's way might help them to make that decision. This technique also helps students to work toward sentence variety in their writing as they try to include different phrases and clauses in their paragraphs. Nancy's way also helps students to determine how to write, for instance, quotations in dialogue. So those are just a few examples. But what I like about this form of sentence diagramming is that it enables students to analyze sentences without breaking them up into those weird angles connected with dotted and solid lines. And it enables students to see as well as hear how sentences work, which in turn enables them to articulate why they're making the writing and editing choices that they're making. Nancy's way enables students to justify their decisions based on the structure of a sentence, not based on the way it sounds or the usual reasoning that just sounds right. So if you decide to make diagramming activities part of your instruction, either the Reed Kellogg version or Nancy's way or any other version, try to figure those sentence diagramming activities into a bigger picture of writing instruction. Or you might use these activities to engage students who bristle at the idea of learning how to edit or how to write. You might find a way to make diagramming a gamified component of your English class. Or you can incorporate diagramming into small group activities or a puzzle. In fact, I encourage you to make sentence diagramming an engaging, fun component of your course so that students will be less inclined to see grammar instruction as a dry, boring exercise. Now that you've been introduced to Nancy's way, let's see if you can diagram some sentences on your own.